events in Odessa. You may remember the bloodshed and the atrocities in the House of the Unions. You remember that those who stood up against the new legal authorities were defending the House of Unions, which was set on fire by the Ukrainian radicals, and dozens of people were burned alive. And those who started the fires were looking at that in joy. They found joy in burning people alive. The entire world saw the chilling pictures of the burned bodies and the violent photos and videos of the people jumping out of the windows and neo-Nazis killing those who were still alive on the ground. And now remember the words of Podolak, who represents the office of Zelensky, who said they would destroy everything and they have the right to do so. And even in Odessa, they didn't follow the law. They were following the call, not of their heart, just of their call, since they have no hearts. This was a repetition of what the Bandera Punishers organized more than 80 years ago in Khatyn in Belarus. But here the building was stronger. And they filmed everything using their mobile phones and video cameras. There were colored pictures of that. However, there was no comprehensive investigation of those events, and the culpables were never found or punished, and many of those who were filmed and could be clearly seen killing the people stayed free, and now they are taking public posts in the so-called Ukrainian state. And let me remind you that this is the exact state that says that it would be the flagship of democracy in the region. And against the backdrop of the lack of law, the police violations, authoritarianism, and the blatant violations of human rights, this is exactly the type of people who come to power. And the Kiev authorities have found a scapegoat. The former head of the militia of public security, Mr. Dmitry Fuchedji. On the 18th of April, the Primorye District Court of Odessa sentenced him to 15 years of prison, accusing him of organizing mass riots and a violation of his authority, which resulted in the tragic events. The people were burned alive, and they say that this is just a violation and excess of his authority. Now they are calling the killings of people mass rioting. And this is exactly what would have happened next. They would never change their mind, and they must be stopped. Following the session of the contact group on military assistance to Ukraine in Ramstein in Germany on the 21st of April, Kiev was supposedly disappointed. We can hear the statements of their so-called diplomat, Mr. Melnik. They did not get the promises of the well-desired aircraft, long-range missiles, and other weaponry. Recently, the head of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, Mr. Melnik, who used to make some atrocious statements as ambassador to Germany, said that the current volumes of military assistance to the Kiev regime were not enough and they needed 10 times more. According to him, the partners had to cross the artificial red lines and allocate 1% of their GDP for military shipments. The appetites of the Kiev regime are growing progressively. The NATO countries have already spent over 65 billion euro for military assistance to Ukrainian armed forces, and they continue training for the Ukrainian servicemen. On the 24th of April, the coordinator for strategic communications in the National Security Council of the White House, Mr. Kirby, boasted that the United States was preparing battalions of Ukrainian soldiers outside of the country using the so-called combined maneuvers. And using these methods, that they would bring together the mechanized infantry with the air defense system, which would allow them to openly operate on the ground. Last week, according to Kirby, Kiev received a new weaponry for the sum of $325 million. The United Kingdom has sent thousands of ammunition pieces for the Challenger 2 tanks, including the depleted uranium weaponry, and they do not consider the consequences of the use of such ammunition. And they openly said that they were not responsible for the use of such ammunition and the consequences of such use. That's right, for them. For them, Ukraine is just a tool. And everything happening there is none of their concern at all, except for one point. They are only thinking about defeating Russia on the political, economical, and military field, etc. This is their only consideration when they're thinking about the territory called Ukraine and the Kiev regime and the citizens of Ukraine. Everything else is none of their concern and none of their responsibility. They have availed themselves of the responsibility for anything. The West openly says that they would do everything possible to make sure that the upcoming counteroffensive of the Ukrainian armed forces coming up shortly becomes a success. They are not even trying to hide that they are behind the military planning, and they're not just providing tactical assistance, they are also providing strategic assistance. And the collective West, through all its representatives, is openly demanding that Russia suffers from the most possible damage, and therefore they once again confirm their direct involvement in the conflict. During the hostilities, the Kiev regime continues to use the terrorist methods. The Ukrainian neo-Nazis continue to operate their firing positions and ammunition warehouses in schools, in hospitals, in apartment blocks, and they use the local civilians as a shield, and they shoot the refugees. The Ukrainian intelligence agencies are organizing terrorist attacks in the Russian Federation. On the 24th of April, the Kiev regime was trying to use 3 unmanned vessels to attack the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, and experts believe that they may have started from the region of Odessa, and their route was lying through the humanitarian corridors using as part of the Black Sea Initiative, the exact initiative that everyone in the West is so concerned about. Such criminal activities of the Kiev regime are a serious hit against the still existing Black Sea Initiative, which is known as the Green Deal in the West. A cynical mockery of the history and the memory of our ancestors. This is the meaning of the another initiative of Zelensky to organize a summit in Kiev on the 8th and 9th of May to celebrate the end of World War II. I wonder if they will set up the portraits of Bandera on the streets that would be used for the guests, or whether they would place the portraits inside of their offices. Is this the way they're going to celebrate? They already have state public holidays, and they're giving street names in honor of the collaborationists. Supposedly they're trying to draw parallels between the fascist aggression and the current events in Ukraine. There are parallels, but not the ones that Zelensky is talking about. They are glorifying the Nazism, and they are working within the neo-Nazi logic themselves. Now they're trying to distort the entire picture. The Ukrainian neo-Nazis are going to celebrate the revenge of the neo-Nazi ideology through such events, and we believe that such meetings, if it takes place, are a blatant mockery of the memories of the peoples of the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and the Soviet people has suffered immense damage and loss. The historians still cannot find a common point and give the exact answer on the number of people who died, who were deliberately destroyed back then. Hitler and all those who supported him, and there were many of those in Europe, had exactly the same ideology, and they were deliberately destroying the people who, for the Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, were of no value and were just an obstacle for the exploitation of the natural resources and the rich lands of the countries. They were deliberately destroying everything. Today, Podolak said that they had the legal right to destroy the people living in these territories. This is exactly the same ideology. This is exactly why they need this so-called summit. I would like to remind you, and I'm not sure if this would reach the Kiev regime, but still I believe there are still some people who are capable of listening to facts. I would like to remind them that on the 2nd of September we mark the end of the World War II, and on the 9th of May we celebrate the victory over Nazi Germany. On this day, the great patriotic war of the people of the Soviet Union was over. There is also a resolution of the UN General Assembly, which states two dates, the 8th and the 9th of May, the Victory Day. But they do not care about that. They are too busy with destroying the population. Zelensky's grandfather was fighting against the brown plague. I cannot even imagine what he would tell his grandson upon seeing what is happening these days. The Kiev regime continues the sanctioned war against our country. On the 22nd of April, it introduced new restrictions against 100 physical and 320 legal entities. This time, the defense industries, the electronics, instrument producers were included in the blacklist, and their foreign partners as well. The sanctions also include all the parliamentary political parties. The Ukrainian authorities are generating new anti-Russian ideas, and on the 25th of April they presented a new plan developed by the head of the office of Zelensky Yermak and the former US ambassador to Russia, Mr. McFall. There was nothing new in this plan. The illegal restrictions are planned to be expanded to include the Russian uranium, metal, jewelry, all oil and gas companies, including Gazprom, as well as full taxation of the Western oil companies remaining in Russia, as well as blocking access for our country to foreign oil and gas services, the end of the shipments to Russia of high-tech produce, which supposedly helps and assists the Russian military. Besides, the personal sanctions could include the heads of the Russian state nuclear energy corporation Rosatom. Such inadequate decisions and the proposals of the Kiev regime once again show that Russia follows the right policy to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and eliminate the threats to security originated from its territory and the protection of the territory and the population. I would like to tell you that more detailed information on the atrocious situation in Ukraine, including human rights situation, can be found in a report prepared by the Russian Foreign Ministry and published on our website. This is a regular report. We had previously published similar documents. This is another regular review of the situation, and in particular it says that the situation related to the human rights in Ukraine in the last 18 months has degraded, and the trends which we see there are seen as very concerning. The systemic suppression of human rights, the opposition in Ukraine have become a deliberate policy of the Kiev regime, which has been in power since 2014.
And one of their goals was a real battle on all fronts, with everything that had to do with Russia. A confirmation is a lot of cases of gross violations of human rights in all spheres of public life, as well as them not being willing enough to correct anything of this situation. Moreover, lately, the Kiev regime has built an authoritarian power which is characterized by usurpation of power, gross censor, liquidation of any independent mass media sources, destruction of political opposition, state propaganda, an active search of traitors, of Russian spies and diversions. Among those people who are none of those things. There's also a new level of Kiev's campaign against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And we see that it's not just a political struggle. It is a real destruction, an effort to destroy the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and an effort to completely ban it, and a massive wave of take over the churches. Use of repressive measures is needed for those who is currently in power in Kiev as the sole and only way of prolonging their existence. But of course, in order to do that, they have to fight against any sort of other thinking that isn't approved by the power, such as faith and religion, and yet none of the steps are taken, as I've mentioned, in human rights sphere, have been taken, not even as an effort. The only sphere where the Kiev regime is showing any initiative is the characterization of Nazism and changing of history, all this negative showcasing, proven by many cases, are all showcased in the published report on our website. I highly recommend everyone to look at it. Mass medias and international experts, politologists. And of course, the link will be available in the text of today's briefing. You know, when we talk about this hypocrisy and how it has reached the international sizes, I'd like to say a few words about a Portuguese journalist, but it is directly linked around the Ukrainian situation and the actions of collective West. I paid attention to the published on the April 9th in the Público newspaper, which is one of the central outlets in Portugal, a story about a Spanish journalist, Pablo González. According to the information from that outlet, Pablo González, who was working as a journalist on the Spanish channel La Sexta in Ukraine, and he started working there even before the special military operation had started, and he had been under the radar of their suspicion for the simple fact of his stories that went against the official Kiev's propaganda. And despite that pressure, despite all these threats, Pablo González, I want to underline that this was published in a Portuguese newspaper. He tried to provide objective information on everything that was going on around Ukraine. And he continued his professional work. At the end of February 2022, he moved to a Polish town, Rzeszów, where he planned to report the situation with Ukrainian refugees. What do you think happened to him? He was detained by Polish special services without any official charges. And for over a year, he's been in custody, and the maximum allowed period of 3 months has been prolonged many, many times. Over that time that he spent in jail, he was only allowed one visitation from his wife. I would like to underline for the third time because it's very important. This is an article, and everything that I'm quoting here from a Portuguese newspaper. As reported by the outlet, neither efforts by the Spanish diplomats or discussions at the ministerial level of Spain and Poland did not lead to any results, and Portuguese media sphere calls it the first case where an EU country continues to keep a journalist without indictment. Can you imagine that? This is what we mean by total hypocrisy. A journalist, Grzegowicz, was detained, and any materials needed to support these claims were provided even publicly. We received redactional letters, even of European outlets about this subject. European outlets from Italy and other countries, Spain, Portugal, Germany, addressed Russian ambassadors to pay attention to the situation and do something about it. And I have one question. This is an American journalist who was caught in Russia. Question for European outlets. When will you start sending any claims to ambassadors of Poland, for example, in your countries? When it comes to detaining a journalist from your countries in Poland? When will you start handling this question? When will you start discussing it at UNESCO? And it's not only a question for newspapers in the European Union, but also for representatives in the European governments. When will this subject around a Spanish journalist who is currently in jail in Poland become a subject of discussion on international platforms and international organizations? Maybe we will finally come up with a resolution. Maybe you will give him a Zakharova prize. Is his fate not as big a deal? And he's your journalist, he's not ours. He's a European journalist, and yet European countries don't care about him. They care more about an American journalist, but not as a journalist, but as a person who tried to get secret documents, who tried to get a hold of them illegally. That's it. These conversations of the collective West are worth nothing. When they mention their concerns about the journalism, about the freedom of speech, they're worth nothing. There's their own journalists. We don't even talk about getting them out of their own jails. They don't even think it's worthy of being discussed in masses. This is a Portuguese newspaper. Where's everyone else? I would like to say that this story is a striking example of West's policy of double standards when the journalist's opinion goes against the official line approved by Washington. This is also the best example how their own journalist, who was imprisoned at home, is considered unnecessary, and they're not asking anyone to pay attention to his fate. Blaming Russia for most heinous crimes, including the oppression of journalists. Western states don't shy away from shameless acts around their own informational field, for trying to broadcast a perspective on the situation in Ukraine that is different from Western mainstream media's. On April 25th, Swedish authorities took another step against our country and announced 5 diplomats as persona non grata in Sweden. It should also be noted that these acts are committed in close cooperation with other Nordic countries as part of informational propaganda in true Western style of highly likely for so-called exposure of Russian spies conspiracy in the north of Europe. You know, I always ask this question either to someone or to other countries in the European Union, always to the UK and to the United States of America, especially after such information. When will you finally make statistics public of how many representatives of your special services are in Europe? We consider this decision by Swedish authorities as part of strengthening confrontational course the country is taking with Russia, and as you know, this behavior will not go unnoticed. Good historical example to support our opinion as we accuse the West of hypocrisy. On the 28th of April of 2004, in the program 60 Minutes, they showed the story of torturing of soldiers in the infamous prison of Abu Ghraib, and after using false pretenses to invade Iraq in 2003, a prison that is located not far from Baghdad became the main location of keeping Iraq people who were accused of crimes against the Western coalition's armed forces. Can you imagine? The coalition fought against Iraq, and then they brought these people to prison who they accused of attacking the West. It's worth reminding that after September 11, 2001, USA made torture as interrogation technique for terrorism suspects, and it's fixed in documents. And this torture technology was widely used in Guantanamo Bay and in special CIA prisons all around the world. Abu Ghraib just became a test site where prisoners were subjected to beating, waterboarding, rape, attack dogs, and tortured with sonic attacks, sleep and food deprivation, electric shocks, and other kinds of physical and moral humiliation. Imprisoned Iraq people who American so-called military people didn't consider even to be human. They have no right to do this. So those who did it, they go way beyond their power as representatives of armed forces. They're sworn in. So imprisoned Iraqis who went through this torture, if they were lucky enough to get out alive, they continue to live with serious injuries. Former prisoners at Abu Ghraib still cannot forget the nightmares they faced there. I want to cite memories of one of the prisoners. This is a direct quote. After my release, every time I was horrified when I saw Americans on the street. I was afraid they would put me back in that prison and would torment me again. Painful memories of torture would not let me sleep. I still hear those screams. End of quote. Despite Abu Ghraib horrors being made public, in particular, by the way, a lot of what was shed light on became possible thanks to an American journalist, Hirsch, who is right now trying to draw attention of the world to terrorist acts in Nord Stream, and even made public a subsequent investigation where he not only posed those questions, but even presented accusations against those countries who are doing it. So, among other things, thanks to the investigation of Mr. Hirsch, only 11 soldiers in the USA were found guilty. Of course, 11 people who are guilty of torture and torment and in the system of these tortures in the US. Of course, it's more than one person who was found guilty of setting fire, as it turns out, to the House of Trade Union in Odessa. I understand that this is more, but is this for real? Are we really expected to believe that 11 soldiers, American soldiers, are responsible for this system of torture? And most of them only got short sentences. And those in high positions of power and senior staff members of Pentagon have never been prosecuted, despite numerous testimonies about their involvement in these crimes. After that, Mr. Rumsfeld, who was back then Secretary of the Defense in the US, wrote that he feels no remorse about how Pentagon interrogated those arrested in Iraq. Atrocity in Abu Ghraib is a vivid illustration of selectivity and double standards policy of the US in human rights area, and such behavior is systematic, as demonstrated by inhumane treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo, which continues to operate to this day, despite numerous calls from international community for its shutdown and numerous promises from American politicians to do so. And more about historic facts that demonstrate against the collective West and their moral rights to dictate their will to other people. The Easter reminded us of the clear fact during the Second World War that British and American people choose to ignore, which they bombarded the capital in 1944. Those strikes were made on Easter, and it was later called Bloody Easter. And Belgrade, as an important industrial center, Anglo-Saxons justified those strikes as a military necessity, like they needed to strike it to stop Romanian exports into Germany. But for some unknown reason, they did not take into consideration or just chose to ignore the fact that the airstrike was planned on the Orthodox Easter. And Belgrade suffered a lot in the 20th century and still suffering today. According to testimonies, the strikes started during the church service. They struck different areas of the city. There were a lot of civilian casualties, women, children. According to modern historians, more than 2,000 people died only in Belgrade. A lot of people had to flee the capital. A lot of historical buildings simply turned to nothing. 16th of April is remembered every year by a prayer in every Orthodox church in Serbia. These bombardments were another proof of inhumane treatment from the West that don't take into consideration any human reasons. And when they choose to use those excuses, every time you understand what is exactly behind those. In the Serbian history, Western strikes repeated at the end of the 20th century in the NATO operation against Yugoslavia from March to June in 1999.
Moving on to other topics, we took note of the reports about the official investigation of former Australian SAS soldier Oliver Schultz. He is accused of murder of an Afghan farmer in Uruzgan province in 2012. The investigation is almost an unprecedented case in the history of Australian justice. As far as we know, up to present, not a single acting or former serviceman of this country have faced criminal charges over crimes committed in Afghanistan. As to the number of these crimes, well, there are myriad of these crimes. It is regrettable that for all these years, the Australian Defence Ministry tried to conceal the atrocities by various means of the Australian soldier, it built upon the deliberately false facts of the investigation, and it neglected many evidence. This mutual cover-up of Australian servicemen was exposed only thanks to the widely circulated video footage. This is a video that was recorded by the helmet camera of the soldier. Basically, this video recorded the killing of an unarmed young Afghani who did not resist. Let me remind to Canberra that so far the praised Australian justice has not launched investigation against 25 other servicemen. From 2009 to 2013, they illegally killed 39 civilians in Afghanistan. Incidentally, data on atrocities of Australian so-called democracy champions were made public only thanks to the investigation of independent experts. By the way, the so-called independent Australian media outlets, that's how they call themselves, as opposed to media outlets from other countries, including Russia, they try to avoid covering this topic. We would like to dwell once again on the notorious freedom of speech, Australian style and Anglo-Saxon style. The Australian authorities sentenced military lawyer David McBride to 50 years in jail. And you know what he was charged for? For publishing documents on the crimes committed by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan. And by the way, this story received public outcry. They got him 50 years for publishing a document, and that is about Australia, modern Australia. It would be fitting to recall the atrocities against unarmed Afghanis by New Zealand. In August 2010, during the Burnham operation, the New Zealand Special Operation Forces killed 6 farmers in the Tigran Valley, wounding 15 persons and killing 1 child. The information about this investigation is not made public. Hypocritical approaches of the UK Defence Office on the investigation of the similar illegal actions by its soldiers in Afghanistan have become routine. Not so long ago, we became aware of new circumstances of heinous crimes in killing of 54 Afghani citizens by the Special Operation Forces of the UK. The investigation was closed without any charges being pressed. But the true masters of these tortures are undoubtedly the United States. Out of hundreds or even thousands cases of so-called strikes by mistake against citizens of Afghanistan, the most outrageous are the US bombings against the Hospital of the Doctors Without Borders, an NGO, on the 3rd of October 2015 in the province of Kunduz. These bombings killed 42 doctors, as well as patients. 43 persons were wounded. And do you think anybody was punished? Of course not, because it is the United States, the most democratic, the most free, the most law-abiding country, the biggest number of lawyers. The majority of the mentioned crimes were reflected in the Foreign Ministry White Book on the killings of Afghani citizens due to illegal actions by the US and its allies. We are continuing to work on the new data of this White Book, and we will provide the relevant link. On the 18th of April, there was a presentation of the innovative sporting movement on the verge of cyber and sport digital. The first competition, the Games of the Future, will take place in Kazan in February 2024. This was organized by the autonomous NGO Agency for the Development of Cybersport with the support of the Russian Foreign Ministry. The presentation brought on board 12 foreign diplomatic missions, heads and members of the Diplomatic Moscow Club, of the Council of young diplomats of 16 missions. there was an opening remark by Deputy Head of the Russian government, Dmitry Chernyshenko, Head of Tatarstan, Minister of Sport, Oleg Matitsyn, President of the International Ice Hockey Federation from 1994 to 2021, René Fazel, and the head of the Games of the Future project, Igor Stolarov. During the event, diplomats were able to learn about Fidgetal, which is an innovative combination of classic sport and cyber sport. It seeks to show a new approach to sporting competitions. Besides that, it covered broad opportunities and the preparation of Kazan to hosting this large-scale international tournament. Foreign guests were provided with details about the testing competition that are taking place in Kazan since 2022. There was also an opening of the sporting competition Alba in the city of Caracas. This key interregional competition brings together some 3.5 thousand athletes from 11 countries in 35 sporting sports. These are open format games, and Russia is a special guest and the only non-regional participant. The Russian team includes 48 athletes. The commemorative ceremony was attended by Minister of Sport Oleg Matitsyn. The participation of Russian athletes in Alba Games took place under national flag without any discrimination whatsoever that were imposed by the International Olympic Committee, and it shows a high level of relations with the alliance members, and it is a contribution to building friendship between our countries and peoples, and it reaffirms the readiness to jointly confront attempts of certain states and international entities to politicize the sport. Let me say once again, that is a wonderful example of a response to those who destroy the international sporting movement. Indeed, that will deal a blow to the international Olympic movement. Regrettably, we see that the International Olympic Committee falls to these attacks, but that doesn't mean that the international sport and the international sporting cooperation, when it comes to cooperation and communication between athletes, it doesn't mean that it has no future. Not in the slightest. I'm positive that the world, the countries and regions and peoples will find their way out, and such competitions, such interregional, intercontinental competitions, and competition at the level of associations and country-based entities, there will be different forms of that contest. But those who believe that they could bring the international sport to the level of dictate by certain countries, they are wrong. That will not be the case. And that is just a case in point. On the 28th of April, we mark the 20 years of the CSTO joint staff. The decision to establish the military staff was adopted by the Collective Security Council of the organization in 2003 in Dushanbe. The joint staff plays an important role in building the military component of the CSTO collective security for the benefit of peaceful development and stability of the member states. It addresses a broad range of tasks related to shaping, functioning, and the use of forces, the collective forces of the CSTO, organizing joint operational and combat training, training specialists for the armed forces of the CSTO, and it ensures the functioning of the crisis center. As we form a coalition, we prioritize the development of all components of the collective forces, taking into account the topical challenges and military security threats within the CSTO area of responsibility and within its border, collective rapid deployment forces, peacekeeping forces, collective rapid response forces. We are equipping them with modern and compatible weapons and military equipment. After biological security threats aggravated in 2022, the CSTO established the Joint CBR Protection and Medical Unit, overall, there were over 60 joint exercises and training of various areas with the components of the collective forces. Since 2017, it took place within the operative strategic exercises combat fraternity in certain regions of the collective security. The exercises are attended by international observers from international organizations in charge of security, as well as representatives of the interested states. There's an ongoing analytical and research effort on the most topical issues of the development of military component of CSTO, engaging expert capabilities of training centers, primarily when it comes to the use of aviation, air defense, intelligence, communications, and so on. Throughout the years of cooperation, there was the training of some 24,000 servicemen of the CSTO member states, including on a preferential or free of charge basis. And another event, that's not an event, rather a multi-year international project from the 29th of April to 9th of May this year, the International Motorcycle Club Night Wolves and the Fund for Support and Development of Patriotic Motorcycle Movement organized the 9th Motorcycle Rally to mark the 78th anniversary in the victory of the Great Patriotic War. Motorcycle Rally helps preserve historical memory on the heroic feat of the Soviet people and the role of our country in the victory over Nazism, patriotic upbringing of the new generation. The march plans to have festive events marking 18th anniversary of the Battle for Stalingrad, the end of the Battle for Caucasus, and this rally will end in Mariupol by opening of a monument, reconstructed, rebuilt monument to the liberators from 221st Mariupol and 130th Taganrog Division. It is breathtaking when we understand what time we're living in and what processes are unfolding. Currently, people, those thugs are trying to desecrate the memory of Soviet liberators. The Kiev regime is destroying monuments. They are torturing the history. And at the same time, there are people, despite all the odds, despite their prosperity and future, they try and they succeed in championing historical memory. And they're doing it for the benefit of their future, because they understand that without a history, there would be no future. That would be just the repetition of same old mistakes. The event will be attended by motorcyclists from Moscow, Kaliningrad, Stavropol region, Rostov, Chechnya, Dagestan, Crimea, representatives of European countries. Via the route, there would be the humanitarian assistance collected for the support of military and civilians in the special military operation area. What are the circumstances of this campaign? Since the anti-Russian sentiments are raging high in the European states, currently it has become quite challenging to have the motorcycle rally abroad. But that happened in the past, that we covered repeatedly. Sometimes they didn't issue visas, sometimes they stopped motorcyclists, they didn't allow us to loan some equipment. There were different cases. This time, there were contacts restricted, primarily in Eastern Europe. Thus, full-fledged organizational assistance was halted, including when it comes to interaction with local authorities and aggressive behavior by the representatives of the, so to speak, Ukrainian diaspora that is supported by local activists, so to speak. It challenges the safety of the participants. Nevertheless, the Russian Foreign Ministry, as has been the case since 2015, will provide the necessary assistance to the organizers and every kind of support. And a few words on the candidates for the International Tolstoy Peace Prize. the Board of Trustees of the Leo Tolstoy International Peace Prize Foundation decided to accept bids for candidacies from the 12th of April to the 12th of June. It will be awarded this year for the first time. Named after the great Russian writer and humanist, this international award will be granted for outstanding achievements and efforts aimed at ensuring comprehensive and equal security, building upon the rule of international law, preventing nuclear disaster, and other significant achievements that build mutual understanding, trust, peace, and cooperation between countries. High-profile international jury will determine the laureates. I believe that you can study the makeup at the organizer's website. I can tell you that the jury includes internationally renowned and acclaimed public activists, writers, political people of culture, science, and business from Russia and Western countries, from Asia, Africa, Latin America. Candidates can be proposed by international organizations, parliaments, authorities, public organizations, and of course members of the jury. You can get more detailed information on the website. We will provide you with a relevant link. There are sad topics. There are funny topics, and there's a mixture of those two. The World Press Freedom Day, allegedly this should be a serious date, especially at the current context. But what is happening around this, it is a tragic comedy. This year marks 30 years since the World Press Freedom Day was established on the 3rd of May. This day, and let me remind you, it was approved by the UN General Assembly upon UNESCO's initiative. This day seeks to draw the attention of governments and the public to the need to guarantee the freedom of media and safety of journalists. Well, that's a mockery, to be honest. The United Nations, the General Assembly, May 3rd, freedom of press, UNESCO, drawing attention. And it is all happening amid the refusal to issue visas to Russian journalists that were going to the very United Nations organization, amid many years of persecution of one of the leading world investigators, Julian Assange, amid persecution of media outlets that do not fit in line with international, and here I'm not talking about not their international quality, but I'm talking about a unifying agenda for the Western media outlets. I'm talking about the trend. Those who do not fit in line, they are being crossed out, they are being persecuted, and it is all happening against the backdrop of journalists that are being jailed. Julian Assange, today I also told you about a Spanish journalist. And still there would be festivities slated and on schedule. Traditionally, to mark the World Day, UNESCO Secretariat holds a subject-based conference. The current anniversary forum will take place at the UN headquarters in New York under the slogan "Shaping a Future of Rights, Freedom of Expression as a Driver for All Other Human Rights." I beg your pardon, what has UNESCO been doing over the past year? Where is the response by UNESCO on Murat Kasayev? Where is the response of UNESCO on a number of cases of persecution of journalists in Ukraine? What is the response of UNESCO with regard to journalists, Russian journalists and writers killed? Or don't you have enough time and money, since you spent everything to organize these festivities in New York? Somebody who is standing on behalf of UNESCO could they find strength to name at least Daria Dugina and all those who were killed or jailed due to their stances as journalists and writers? Or they will continue telling you about human rights without even understanding what kind of human they're relating to. Unfortunately, despite such an ambitious bid, organizers failed to ensure such basic freedom conditions of freedom of speech as pluralism of opinion, non-transparent choice of rapporteurs behind the closed doors does not give any hope for any kind of inclusive discussions, and it being non-biased. On the contrary, we are confident that there would be no equality, non-discriminatory participation. That would not happen. It looks like neoliberal champions of freedom of expression are openly guided by the overall Ministry of Truth practices, and they divide this multifaceted media landscape into friendly and enemy media outlets, into good journalists and what they call propagandists. We urge the secretariats of the international entities engaged in promoting non-universal agenda in journalism and mass communications to be guided by impartiality as they prepare for events that claim to be international. As for the upcoming forum in New York, we can quote Joseph Borrell, and we believe that this get-together of civilized residents of the wonderful garden does not have any added values to the residents of wild jungles.
And I have another announcement to make. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we're currently taking registration for the 5th Leaders of Russia competition. This flagship program of the Russia Land of Opportunity program, and 70 countries have already applied to take part in the competition, and foreign citizens have been taking part in this event since the second season of the event, and ever since the applications for the competition have been sent by over 150 countries, and 80% of the UN member states are represented here. The winners of the 5th season of the Leaders of Russia, who are foreign citizens, apart from the main prizes, would also have an opportunity to get the Russian citizenship using the simplified procedure, and they would also get residence permit in the Russian Federation. I would like to remind you that according to the order of the Russian Federation President, 27 participants of the competition of the 4th season were given Russian citizenship. There were members from the United States, Poland, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Belarus. And in the past 4 seasons, altogether, throughout all the seasons, there have been applications from over 150 countries. The overall number of applications was over 800,000. And if you would like to take part in this competition, you can do this until the 14th of May using the website. The link will be available in text of the briefing. And now I'm ready to answer your questions. Is the International Affairs magazine with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. Recently, Josep Borrell, who you just mentioned, said that the European Union would establish relations with other countries, taking in mind their positions on Russia and China. Let me quote him. We must work with a larger number of third countries who must fight against the Russian narratives in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, said Mr. Borrell, adding that he had prepared an entire plan. How could you comment on that statement? On the 25th of April, the Russian permanent mission to the European Union has already published its comment. I would like to add a couple of words on that. This statement by Mr. Borrell is quite inadequate, since he is both a diplomat and a representative of the European Union. He has a claim to the role of a person who states the position of the UN member states and the people of the European Union. And this goes against the interests of these countries and these peoples, and therefore no one asks them when they establish such positions. And this is another example of the ideologization of the European project and the violations by the EU leadership of one of the founding principles of the UN Charter, talking about the respect for sovereignty and the independence of the states in defining the ways of their own development, their internal and external policies. And we also see a certain sense of segregation, an approach to separate between those who have the right to live however they want and have the right to build their relations and their sovereign foreign policy however they want, and those who do not have such rights and those who will receive orders from the first group regarding how they should live and act and so on. Fairly recently, the EU, in their bilateral contacts and in the public statements, were openly denying any hints at giving the artificial geopolitical choice to the states, saying you're either with us or against us. But now they're talking about this openly. Previously, they were talking about the freedom of choice for the countries and the ways they can interact with certain subjects of international relations. And at the same time, they were using economic measures against those who did not want to service the interests of the West. They were using the so-called monetary stimulation measures. They introduced various restrictions against them. You may remember everything that was concerning the visa regime and the agreements on the visa-free travel. These are also the tools for controlling the situation. And these are the tools for exerting influence on the several countries. And even if the countries are loyal to the European Union, that is not a guarantee for their well-being. They were exploiting these states, using their resources and creating their dependence on the EU, and in case of any economic problems, they were left alone to their own devices. And the revelations by Josep Borrell are of no surprise, and he does such statements regularly. Why are they inadequate?
Because they're made of ultimatums and hypocrisy. Unfortunately, these are the main things of their logic. And it doesn't add popularity to the European Union. And in an effort to fix the European Union with this propaganda, with frightening threats, and with blocs fighting against each other, only isolates the European Union more and more. And we see it even now, how they only suffer more from their efforts to separate the world with this veil. We used to have the Iron Veil, and now they have another logic. They definitely don't judge by themselves. They see humanity as a plant, and that is how they see everyone. Thank you very much. I also have another question. On the 20th of April, Latvia has prohibited celebrating the Victory Day. This is a blasphemy and the demonstration of what this Latvian regime is all about. This is another demonstration that lawmakers of that Baltic country are following revanchist goals. For them, May 9th is not the Victory Day, but the Day of Loss. And for us, this is the day when we overthrow Nazi. And there is no other way to see it. There is no other way of interpreting it. I would also like to add, it's also worth reminding that Latvian parliament doesn't represent the whole population, because some people, non-citizens, they're deprived of the possibility to vote. They're deprived of basic democratic right to take part in elections. They can decide of who sits in the higher lawmaking body of the country. So everything that is happening there is another sign of what that regime is all about, that is now in power in Latvia.
This is not an indicator of the sentiments of the population in total, in general. And also I would like to say that we see that this regime is not trying to conceal its support for the neo-Nazism, and the fact that they support Ukraine in this situation correlates with their historical vision, and this showcases the fact that we are saying things as they are, and we are right to accuse them of supporting neo-Nazism and the new expressions of fascism. And now this history, this story, has made a full circle. This is not about certain single politicians or singular events or words taken out of context. This is a deliberate policy of a certain regime, which is also sponsored by the West. This is their deliberate policy to support historical collaborationism during the World War II years, and today they are also supporting the Kiev regime and the neo-Nazi sentiments and the attempts to legalize them in Ukraine. Thank you very much. Is the Rush Today TV channel with us? Yes, hello. My first question. James Rubin, the press secretary of the State Department during the NATO aggression against Serbia, when the radio television of Serbia building was exploded. Now he serves as a special representative of State Secretary Antony Blinken, and through Radio Free Europe he demands the closure of the RT Balkans and says that the Russian media should not be present anywhere in the world. And several days later, the same source says that the European Union, within the new package of anti-Russian sanctions, is preparing sanctions against the RT Balkan. How could you make a comment on that, and how could you explain the need for the leaders of the Western countries to choke the media who are working against their interests? Thank you. You see, the situation is quite absurd, and these statements speak for themselves. They are not trying to hide anything, they are openly talking about this. Today we have touched upon this several times. We saw the statements by Podolak saying that they were permitted to kill the people on these territories and they had the legal right to do so. And in the same manner, the statement that he made today demonstrates the wish to destroy the media. So how else can we comment on that? We are already saying that evil is evil. How can I make any additional comment or characteristic to that? How else can I characterize that? Previously, we were actually trying to draw everyone's attention to double standards and hypocrisy, but now they're talking about this openly, and they say that there should be no Russia. It is saying that there should be no Russian culture and that there should be no Russian language. They would prefer if Russia didn't exist at all, at least in the current scale. They are against the Russian media, they are against the Russian journalists. This is exactly what they're talking about in the open. And there's no need for any additional comments. We can only say that this is a purely imperialist point of view, an expression of neo-colonialism when some countries without any moral right to do so are trying to illegally claim the right to model the world and the global development the way they see fit. They believe they have the right to choose who has the right to talk, to trade, to produce, who has the right to reproduce, and who has no right to do so. I believe that this is a modern reading of the slavery practices when the metropoly attributed themselves the right to consider themselves the masters while the others were considered slaves. they are treating others in such a manner when they are too weak. But we are not weak and we can answer to them. If they like such rules of the game, they're welcome to do so. But we do not like that. So now they're saying directly that they want Russia to have no opportunity to share its point of view. They want the Russian media abroad to cease to exist, since the Russian media are an obstacle for the collective West led by the United States in their efforts to work with the minds of the global public. Our media and our journalists, through their reports from the centers of the global events, provide their own analysis based on facts, and they are pushing the people to take a critical view of the situation, and this is a normal situation, in fact. I believe this may go against the plans that even the American leaders have against their own population. They're trying to turn them into zombies. If you watch the American television, you see that they're giving quite sterile versions of the global events. They only provide very refined and loaded views on the global events. This is why any alternative points of view are being discredited for the public. Any alternatives are discrediting their own mass media, who are so politicized and push their own agenda that they even contradict themselves. They find themselves in an ideological stalemate, and this is exactly what we've been talking about regularly. This is another manifestation of what we've been talking about and giving relevant examples. Thank you. And the second question, how would you comment on the elections in the north of Kosovo and Metohija, which only involve 13 Serbs, and why does the West support these elections despite the boycott of the Serbian population? And another question, just let me give an answer to this first. Yes, and I have a question. What are elections without voters, and what is the goal of such elections? Thank you. I would like to say that we immediately given a comment on this so-called election. It was published on the website on the 24th of April, and it said that the temporary authorities in Pristina continue to escalate the situation in Kosovo, and they deliberately lead the dialogue with Belgrade into a stalemate, and once again the Serbian population, its rights and freedoms are suffering, and another manifestation of this was the organization of the so-called municipal elections on the 23rd of April in the Serbian northern part of the region, and despite the boycott of the Serbian majority, the so-called election still took place under the pressure from the West, and the Serbs boycotted this mockery of election. 96.5% of the voters did not come to vote, and the low voter count of 3.5% from the non-so-numerous Albanians and the lack of elementary conditions for voting. You know that 2/3 of the polling stations were using mobile containers, but none of this was an obstacle for Pristina to call the election a success, and they even declared the winners. And now all the 4 people who have been elected, who have received from 100 to 519 votes, while the people with the right of vote make up almost 46,000 people. This is exactly what the rule of law, the so-called rule of law, looks in Kosovo. This is what the United States and the European Union like to talk about. This is how they see the future of this region. This is exactly how they see it. And let me repeat, this is a very open example. And this showcases what democracy may look like if the United States come there, and if the EU comes there under the aegis of the US. They're trying to replace the legal election procedures with the mockery of the elections, with the approval of the Western sponsors. They're trying to deprive the Serbians of any right of vote. They're organizing terror against the Serbs, And the so-called Prime Minister continues to pursue this policy. The Kosovars boast that they do not comply with their obligations, and they are working against the establishment of the Serbian municipalities, and they are building up the presence of heavy weaponry and spec ops and police forces in the Serbian regions, and they are intimidating their own citizens. The emissaries from Washington and from Brussels have long been playing into the ideas of the Pristina authorities, and they at the same time did not talk about the rise of the threat of Albanian nationalism. And as a result, the EU mediation has turned into a conveyor of the so-called options to settle the Kosovo-Albanian issue. This cannot be called a settlement. This cannot be called a resolution of the disputes. The so-called municipal elections have showcased the damaging policies of the West in the region, and the debate for lack of law and discrimination and ethnic cleansing cannot lead to peace and agreement, and the US-EU link is unable to overcome the anti-Serbian sentiments. And this leads Kosovo into a deeper crisis. And the Serbs, who did not wish to take part in these pseudo-elections, have demonstrated their true national dignity, unity. In these hard conditions, they stood ready to be with Belgrade. That is it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is Zvesti with us? Yes, good afternoon. I have a first question. Sergei Lavrov has sent signals to Mr. Guterres on violations or the lack of compliance with the grain deal by our opponents. What is the limit of the Russian patience to continue our participation in this deal? I would like to correct you. We are not sending any signals. This was a negotiation which was lasting a long time. I'm talking about the talks between Russian foreign ministers and the UN Secretary General. And almost the entire time they were talking about the implementation, or rather the lack of implementation, of the Black Sea Initiative, or the Grain Deal as it's known in the West. This is what I'd like to say about the signal and the limits of our patience. Russia has only extended it by 60 days, saying that we do not believe that the implementation is quite satisfactory for us. This is why we have stated our position, and we have received a package of proposals from the UN Secretary General for the Russian President for the development or the implementation of the so-called Black Sea Initiative or the Green Deal, and all of this is currently being worked on, and the decision will be made following the interministerial and agency consultations.
Thank you very much. And the second question is about the visit to the headquarters of the UN in New York. How do we see this multipolar world that we're trying to present? I would like to divide these two questions. The visit, as you said, to New York and taking part in the UN Security Council, or more presiding of the UN Security Council, was another opportunity to introduce the international community to our approaches to this question. We weren't coming up with anything groundbreaking. We were simply sharing our beliefs, and we were trying to draw attention in order for our basic foreign policy course to become more clear, to become more understandable. Russia supports more fair democratic world order that would ensure security, fair opportunities for development of all countries. And we can guarantee that in the multipolar system of international relations. As for how you can get to know this concept, This is the foreign policy. It was introduced by our president on the 31st of March. It is available. You can read it. Some of you maybe have already done that. Principle of non-intervention into internal affairs. And these principles are written there. And of course, with the materials from Mr. Lavrov's presidency, I also highly recommend you to... Okay, let's move on. Is our TVI with us? Yes. Hello. Recently, Mr. Lavrov visited Latin American countries, and after visiting Brazil, he mentioned that they discussed BRICS, and they said that 19 countries expressed interest in entering BRICS. Did the minister discuss any mechanism of entering BRICS during his visit? This subject is, of course, discussed in our contacts with BRICS countries and two-country format and five-country format. And we regularly discuss it with our Brazilian colleagues. This is of great importance to us, and it is under our scope of attention. We discuss it with heads of states, with foreign ministers. In the Beijing Declaration of 14th BRICS Summit is fixed the order to work out principles, standards, criteria, and procedures. And discussion of that complex is conducted under the SHERP and SUSHERP mechanism of BRICS countries. Of course, it needs an in-depth analysis, and we will try to reach that consensus. So yes, we regularly discuss that subject and all those possibilities. But of course, as you understand, we cannot reveal the details of that process. It is too early for us to do so. Thank you. Is Newsru with us? Yes, hello. After the point of control was set at the Azerbaijan border, people in Yerevan have called to fulfill their obligations in the three-party statement. And the responsibility for everything happening there and all these events is on Moscow. How does Moscow react to these statements? I don't know if this is a call or if this is them being mad. Maybe, as it sounds from your words, it's just a call. I would like to say that Russia has made our position clear in a statement from the ministry on April 24th. And right now, in peacemaking and in a political level, we're giving our best efforts in order to regulate the situation around the Latin corridor, in order to return it to how things were on November 9th, 2020. And we consider it very important that Yerevan brings its own input into this situation. Second question. Kazakhstan agreed to give accreditation to the Talib representatives in the Republic. Does Moscow have the same plans? That is a very unexpected question. All questions today require not just my answer, but also a bit of correction. Why do you connect Kazakhstan's decision and then ask me about it? Especially since representatives of new powers in Afghanistan received their accreditation in Moscow last year. We still have a working embassy of Afghanistan in Moscow. It's executing its functions. I'm not one to judge if it's functioning or not. This is a question for Kabul. But they stay in contact with their ministry, and from March 2022, and responsible for Afghanistan is Jamal Nasir Garval. He's executing planned diplomatic work, and I cannot leave this subject undeveloped. Our embassy in Kabul doesn't stop functioning, even after the change of power in Afghanistan in August 2021, our diplomatic mission ensures development of practical cooperation between Russia and Afghanistan. So I think you made an interesting choice of connecting Afghanistan with a subject that isn't relevant to us because we've been working on it for a while after new reality, after 2020. And it is a successful work. In our last question, you mentioned that UN General Secretary shared his proposals on the realization of grain deal. Did Russia have enough time to get acquainted with that proposal? And does Russia find them acceptable? All the materials were handed over to the Russian president, and as I've already mentioned, the decision will be made after the work between the departments. Okay, let's move on. Is Radar with us today? Yes, hello. As for our questions, you've mentioned some of it, for example, the Green Deal. We just wanted to ask, based on the statement by Sergei Lavrov at the UN headquarters, that the Green Deal is currently at a deadlock. It's more of a general question, but also, judging on Russian Foreign Ministry's position, is there anything that can save this deal? Only full implementation of this deal. It's as simple as that. It consists of two parts and they have to be implemented. Not making a choice. It's not a buffet where you can choose what you want and then ignore everything else. No, these are obligations that have to be implemented exactly as they were written on paper. If everything were to be implemented, we perfectly understand that the situation is difficult. It's changing very fast. There are a lot of obstacles. But if it was agreed upon by different parties and accepted as basis for our work, everyone has to deliver on those obligations. We have heard a lot during those negotiations in New York about the efforts that the UN Secretariat puts into implementing that deal, but those efforts are not enough. Of course, we understand that clearly there is no clear necessity to doubt the UN General Secretary's words. Those efforts are being made, but we also have to point out that these efforts, they don't reach their full potential, the full goal. Somehow, some part of it, but globally, the second part of Black Sea Initiative is not being implemented. It doesn't work yet. Thank you very much. And another question. You've also touched upon that in the initiative part. It has to do with the statement of the working group, International Working Group on Sanctions Against Russia, that consists of Western civil workers, and specifically it was talking about lower the ceiling of prices to $30 per barrel, and also introduce an embargo on diamonds and metal. Is Russia prepared for those restrictions? Or are there maybe any countermeasures prepared right now? What are those measures? You know, unilateral restrictions, sanctions, and restrictive measures of the collective West, with Washington in the head, of course. It's a disease. And it is a disease of the current Western liberal system. It is a progressive disease. And the only question that we can ask concerning that is there a treatment for that, or is all hope lost? Because for all the destruction that was caused by these sanctions, restrictions in Western countries themselves, there are a lot of those, and they are systemic. And another question, can this be reversed or not? And if so many years, I'm not even talking about globalized economic opportunities, potential, or of the general market. Of course, this is a passing subject. But if for so many years they were trying to build market mechanisms, not even within unified market, but within different markets in the West, then by introducing more actions against Russia, but mostly unilateral actions and sanctions, they just kill off any ideology of market mechanism. And it's not just about liberal markets, but simple market mechanisms. And of course, it's clear that these unprecedented unilateral measures against us have taken a serious hit on the economy. It just started getting better after the crisis that was caused by the COVID pandemic. We're seeing lowering of business activity, of production and chains. We're seeing the growth of volatile financial markets, growth of jobless people. Analytics openly discuss the threat of the industrialization of Europe, and representatives of EU countries can't replace Russian gas. So they choose the liquid gas, which is harming, of course, importers in Asian and developing countries. In other words, the US, trying to spin the sanction spiral towards Russia, are using methods of unfair competition towards their European allies, and the latter trying to use green development, just push that problem of economy on developing countries. And of course, the West is taking care of needing and developing countries. So the main marketing restrictions will only affect the economy badly, will lead to the deficit of material, which will lead to the growth of prices and all the other processes. Unfortunately, in the end, those actions of the collective West of introducing unilateral sanctions, the ones taking the hit the most will be the developing countries. And the West, using that colonial past, has learned to push those problems that they've created towards the weaker ones, the less prepared ones, the developing ones. Of course, we will continue adapting the national economy to the new realities in financial and marketing sphere when it comes to replacing imported products. And of course, we'll continue growing our export and finding new partners. As you understand, in this case, we have a clear understanding of how we're supposed to act. To rely or to expect from the West to change their minds, we have no time or patience for that, so we just keep going forward. And we will use everything at hand in order to protect our interests. And the fact that we're sustaining that sanctions pressure and strengthening our economy is already said in the West openly and officially. So I think that it will be more useful for you to take their quotes and not mine. If you don't have any more questions, we can proceed. Yes, that's all. Please, Media Corporation of China, hello. We only have one question. The EU countries and Japan spoke against the U.S. proposal of the total refusal to export in Russia, which was quoted in Financial Times. And Washington introduced that measure because they are not satisfied with the system that allows Russia to import products. But also Financial Times points out that the U.S. want to make their proposal public at the G7 meeting in Hiroshima in May. How would you comment that? You know, What Washington does with the European Union reminds me of the situation: take a breath and then don't breathe, and then you just stop breathing. And so right now they're just proposing that we stop breathing. So they're not afraid of showing the sanctions as an instrument of changing the course of sovereign states. So they consider it a normal measure of going about their business to win when they have competition, to intervene with internal affairs, to control the situation of internal policy, of influence on current people in power. And there are a lot of reasons for that: economic destabilization, the worsening conditions of life or conditions for business. And right now, the collective West, even in those unions, they consider it to be normal. So it's not just a measure out of necessity, no. So if they have survived, the West didn't have plans for our survival, but we keep going on. We keep developing. We deal with our daily problems that we had after the actions of the collective West. And of course, they're annoyed by that. And use of new commercial restrictions by Russia is an economic war which underpins the rules of multilateral commerce, of mutually beneficial cooperation. And it threatens not just Russian direction and how the European Union interacts with us, but even their ideas of market economy, of liberal economy, of free competence. And it's no longer surprising how these strategists ignore economic losses that Western producers feel in the consequences for Russian market. But I've already touched upon this subject in the previous question.
Since you have only one question, let's move on. Moscow Post. Hello, we have two questions. First, how would you resolve this issue of countermeasures after Russian journalists were banned from entering the US? I would not make it public so far because I do not want to spoil the surprise to you. Okay, second question. Did the Russian delegation in New York had bilateral contacts with the State Department on strategic stability? Yermakov, director of the Foreign Ministry Department, said that the U.S. already played too far with such chimeras as the de-escalation, the escalation pressure. Well, first, as for contacts with the U.S., there were no contacts with the American side during the visit of Minister Lavrov. Had there been any contacts, we would comment on that. As for the Russian position, indeed, there were no contacts on the matters you've mentioned or on any other matters. Second, the Russian position on the New START treaty was clarified to the American side in every detail. The U.S. has not asked us for any new clarifications. As for the strategic dialogue, since it has been put on ice by Washington, there have been no developments so far. Maybe that is not possible when the U.S. policy is going further from diplomacy. It is moving away from a dialogue on an equal footing. It does not care for the Russian interests and security concerns. It doesn't believe that they should be respected. As for your other question on the specific quote, well, basically that means that attempts to put the most pressure by the U.S., they are risky, and probably there are some games they continue to deliberately violate our core interests, deliberately generate risks, and raising the stakes in their standoff against Russia. They try to test our patience, and they make their bet on the complete and dominating control over the situation at all points of its development that would prevent any damage to the US or minimize it as compared to the damage done to the opponent, namely Russia. It looks like they are being trapped in such illusions, and this can be also said with regard to the hypothetical, as the expert put it, the ladder of nuclear escalation, at least when it comes to the first stages of this ladder, as they see it. These are all dangerous misperceptions. Moreover, such an approach directly contradicts Western statements on the commitment to avoiding strategic risks, including the danger of sliding into direct military confrontation between nuclear powers. Russia will do its utmost to prevent the dangerous scenario, as was indicated repeatedly by the Russian leadership, but not at the expense of our vital interests, naturally. Having said that, you shouldn't doubt our resolve and test it. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Is that it? Okay, Moscow, Baku, are you here with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova. The first question. American and French sides continue to keep the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan at crosshairs. Lately, there have been unilateral statements that are not impartial with regard to Azerbaijan. And currently, the foreign minister of France started her visit. Such a visit is a message. Can we expect some kind of a positive result? Or as far as I know, the US, namely France, had its bid for an honest broker in Armenia and Azerbaijan settlement. I believe that they failed miserably with regard to the situation that we are seeing, namely attempts of the French and American colleagues to convince everybody that they are guided by exceptional interest of ensuring peace in Southern Caucasus. They are disavowed by their repeated anti-Russian attempts. There have been no constructive efforts and efforts of honest broker. The real aspiration of Washington and Paris are politicized. They are aimed at undermining Russian stance, and the care for the future of people of the region is of no concern to them. And this is confirmed once again by the fact that, unfortunately, when it comes to other situations, the conflicts that are still persisting, they are still guided by their political concerns, anti-Russian sentiments. They do not have any added value, any constructive spirit. They are making the situation worse with their presence. And in the public space, they just talk about care for the population, from human rights to the love for certain countries and peoples. But basically, they're just implementing their goals and tasks. Thank you. And the second question, a follow-up to the first one. What can you say about the prospects for the ministerial between Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Russian territory? At some point in time, this was discussed, and currently Western colleagues in the US and the EU are claiming that they are working on this matter on a possible meeting in their territory. There is a specific arrangement that we have reached, and we will outline and announce the date further on. Anadolu Agency. Good day. We're here with us. We have 3 questions. The first one, what does the Foreign Ministry think about media reports that G7 is considering a complete ban of export to Russia? I have already commented on this matter. I can say that, once again, this comes as no surprise. Probably there would be some other more absurd language. I cannot rule this out because in their interpretation, this is the rules-based order. They would invent rules and they would make others follow these rules. As for new trade restrictions against our country, once again, this undermines the universal principles of international trade competition, and they bring to naught the norms of sovereign equality and win-win cooperation. As for the reverse laws, that is of no concern to them because that is the matter of the EU, and Washington would not think about any other states. As you know, should there be any new sanctions against us, we would respond in a calibrated, well-balanced manner. We will be guided by the interests of ours, by our citizens, and by the interests of Russian economy and Russian business community. We seek to further develop interaction with credible partners that stick to the constructive course in relations with Russia, that are not ideologicalized, they do not seek to destroy everything. They are pragmatic and they are committed to universal international norms, enshrined rules, and not some inventory whims. For their part, these states enjoy access to dynamic market of Russia, to the Eurasian Economic Union, broadly speaking. As foreign companies leave Russia, certain niches are being liberated, and this could be fulfilled. This could be filled by other countries that seek to have pragmatic cooperation. Thank you. The Office of the UN Secretary General reported that Guterres provided a detailed report on the achieved progress in implementing the Russian part of the grain deal, and he reported it to Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister. Could you share some details on the progress that has been mentioned? You know, I've already shared the details, and probably the best way to put it, it's a progress, attempted progress. But we want to see a progress in results. I'm sorry for this follow-up question, but he was confident in stating that there was a certain progress. Well, I've already commented on it broadly, and I can only repeat what I have said. Okay, thank you. And last question. Coordinator for Strategic Communication of the National Security Council, John Kirby, welcomed a telephone call between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Zelensky. And he said that we need to look whether it could result in peace. What's your take of such a response by Washington following the telephone conversation between President Xi and Volodymyr Zelensky? You know, every time we see this inconsistency in the U.S. statements, because these very people have recently called for resolving the situation on the battlefield. They said that there is no time for negotiations. They haven't supported the China Peace Initiative, the relevant plan and the relevant paragraphs. Now they are claiming different things. I've already said that commenting on such individual attitudes of somebody, and that's not clear what kind of attitude it is, whether it is the attitude of the White House or broader United States. We're not aware of that because there's a contradiction, and this leads to a deadlock. We see an opposite response by the United States indeed, namely pumping up of weapon supplies, funding of Kiev regime and its atrocities, and that is their real attitude towards any peace plan and initiative. Without any doubt, they are the ones who benefit from continuing atrocities, continuing hostilities. Thank you. Al-Mayadin channel, are you here with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Thank you for this opportunity to ask a question. First of all, welcome back. It's good in the United States, but it's much better in Russia. Well, it's not that I was in America, I was in the UN headquarters, and it is quite interesting there, very dynamic. As for the United States, I cannot say anything in this regard. I've been working day in, day out. You probably saw that. Yeah, sure. A question on Sudan. It is a dominant topic in the Arab news, and not only there. Three sub-questions, if I may. First, is there any update in Russian stance around the tragic developments there? That's the first question. Well, why don't you voice out all the questions? The second question has to do with the evacuation of Russian citizens and diplomats. Have you made a decision? It is well known that other countries are doing that. Recently, Saudi Arabia has said that it helps other countries to evacuate citizens, that it is in contact with other countries. And the last question has to do with statement from Washington. Now, Blinken said that Russia is involved in these developments. Okay, I got it. Yeah, the Wagner Group. What is happening in Sudan, these dramatic developments are of serious concern to us. As you know, we urge the parties to the conflict to exercise political will, restraint, to take emergency steps to ensure the ceasefire. We believe that all the contradictions can be resolved via negotiations. We take all the necessary measures to ensure safety of Russian citizens in Sudan, including the opportunity to ensure evacuation. Indeed, we are asked by other countries on this matter to provide for evacuation, and we are keeping in touch with a number of states. As you understand, this also has to do with security concerns, so let me assure you that this is a topic that we are actively considering, and we will brief you on the results of this consideration. We'll keep you abreast. As for the last part of your question, indeed, this topic has been commented at length by Foreign Minister Lavrov in New York at his press conference on the 25th of April. And you can find the script at the website of the Foreign Ministry. Thank you. Tverskaya 13. Good day, Madam Zakharova. We have three questions. The first one, threats on nuclear strike, goes as follows. There would be no nuclear strike if we take Crimea back. Does this mean that Ukraine is threatening with the use of nuclear force to violate the territorial integrity of Russia? Well, for starters, we do recall statements by Zelensky that are nothing but an attempt to revisit the non-nuclear status of Ukraine. You do remember these multiple statements. We also recall multiple calls for preventive strike of NATO countries against Russia. We do recall the statements of acting politicians to make a nuclear strike against Russia. The assessment of these inappropriate ideas have been provided on multiple occasions. So with regard to the statements by Zelensky, it comes as no surprise, as nothing new to us. These are reckless statements, provocations, keeping the relevant topics afloat that are high profile for the sane part of humanity. We don't think it is necessary to study every painful cry that are in abundance among the Kiev regime, because indeed they are in some kind of inappropriate, ill state, and everybody sees that. Globally, this shows the essence of the Kiev regime. As for the necessary conclusions, they have been drawn for quite some time by both Russia and a part of the international community who sees this Kiev clique as something that is illegitimate, internationally illegitimate phenomenon. And they consider it in such a way because it has the opportunity to be guided by its own analysis and assessments and not by ideas that are imposed by the West. As for the nuclear weapons that could come into Ukraine or the creation of a dirty bomb, all these attempts are being carefully studied by the relevant Russian agencies. The second question has to do with the statement by Director of the Disarmament Department, Yermakov. He says that Russia could avoid a moratorium on the placement of intermediate-range missiles following U.S. actions. Does this mean that Russia could deploy missiles in other countries other than Belarus? If you take a look at the original statement, you would understand that he was talking about the connection between the moratorium for the deployment of short and intermediate range missiles. This moratorium is in place until the similar American weapons are deployed. Pentagon officials do not hide their plans for the prompt deployment of the relevant missiles in Europe and the Asia-Pacific to confront Russia and China. They even brag about that. The only factor that doesn't let them do that is the fact that these missiles have not been completed. The work is still in the pipeline, but we see that the resources are being funneled to that end, and in the near future, the US could start deploying such systems. Basically, that's what makes the Russian moratorium even more fragile, and certainly we need to take into account the general degradation of the strategic situation as a result of the hostile policy by the US and its allies, as well as the whole gamut of destabilizing military programs conducted by it. And we take it seriously. When it comes to Russia-Belarus interaction in military and nuclear area, it is carried out strictly within the borders of the Union state, which constitutes the United Common Defense Area, and we have the opportunity to ensure the steps to defend both Russia and the Union state. And speculating on additional countermeasures, I believe I will not engage in that. It is pointless. This will fit the threats that are generated by the United States and NATO. Thank you. And the last question. There are cynical calls to limit the import of medication to Russia. How would you comment on such statements that are at odds with European humanism?
I am very skeptical of what you're calling the European humanism, since you can say anything, but their actions prove otherwise. And they cannot speak for the entirety of Europe, since the Russian Federation is a major part of Europe. So let us be clear, it is the European Union. So here's my opinion on the humanity of the European Union. Brussels seems to forget about any humane principles when they rush into something like the anti-Libyan campaign or the anti-Iraq campaign. The countries involved in the European Union take part in such illegal actions, and they do not think about humanism, they do not think about the refugees, they do not think about the economies of the regions that they attack, they do not think about the consequences, and they have never thought about compensations to the people who have suffered from their own experiments. How can we talk about any humanity here? No, this is an anti-humane policy. That's the first point. And the second point, such statements that you have mentioned should be commented on by Austria itself. These are shameful statements by their civilians and their civil society, and Vienna should be responsible for that, either at the level of the health ministry or any humanitarian agencies. I'm not sure. This is not a matter for me to comment on. This is a shameful statement that is up to the Austrian authorities to comment upon. They have a great number of capacity and opportunity to talk sense into the people who are expressing such anti-human logic. This is anti-human logic, that it has various expressions. This is not only about the direct calls for murder or the segregation. This may also be about something more soft, something more subtle. For example, the intention to segregate the people into those who have the right and don't have the right to get medication. This is the West we're talking about, the West that worked against the certification of the Russian vaccines. This is the West that reinforced the sanction policy against Syria during the pandemic, when Syria was suffering from the consequences of the attack by international terrorists and the sanctions pressure from the West. This is the West that deprived the Latin American countries of the opportunity to overcome the Western sanctions in order to get medical access during the pandemic, when the medication was in such high demand. What else is to be expected of them? So, from the point of view of their historical role, I mean the role of the West, now it would be more preferable for them to negate such statements, but it is up to them to decide. Okay, thank you. Mr. Uradot, are you with us? Yes, Artem Alexander for Raru. I had 3 questions. One of them relates to the progress regarding, well, we've heard our position on the grain deal. I believe you've already made a comment on that, and you mentioned the progress, so I'll move on to the next question. Some time ago, the president of South Africa said that the country was going to withdraw from the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and later the ruling party of South Africa said that the president had made a mistake. But still, I wonder if, in your views, such statements or ideas, can they be related with the arrest warrant by the ICC for President Vladimir Putin? And can we say that Russia welcomes the possible aspirations of other countries to withdraw from the ICC? Such statements or declarations that are made by another sovereign state at various levels, and there were several statements, I do not believe it is necessary to make a comment on that. There are official positions of the state, and there are various ways to elaborate such positions, and as soon as they formulate this position, we can make a comment on that. But so far, this is an internal matter for South Africa. This is a matter of internal debate, and we cannot make a comment on that. Sure, we have seen such statements, and we have taken note of them. Speaking of our attitude toward the International Criminal Court, the so-called ICC, you know it very well. The International Criminal Court, as it calls itself, has been unable to become a universal, impartial body of international justice. Instead, it has turned into another tool for Western political pressure and propaganda. Let me remind you that back in 2016, the President of the Russian Federation signed an order that the Russian Federation had no intention to join the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. This is our position, and it is not subject to any decisions or of this so-called structure. Our position had been elaborated long before that, back in 2016. Over 6 years ago, we had made an official statement on that, and we have reaffirmed it many times. Okay, thank you. And the second question. The ambassador of the People's Republic of China in Paris, Liu Shaye, gave an interview to a French channel, and he said that the states that appeared following the breakup of the USSR had no effective status in the global law, since there is no international agreement which would specify their status as sovereign states. Keeping in mind that Russia does not believe that the 1991 borders are relevant. How can you comment on this position of the Chinese ambassador? We have heard the statements that you have mentioned, but we believe that any explanations regarding the statements of the ambassador are a prerogative of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. The relevant comments have already been given by the official representatives of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Mao Ning, on the 24th of April. Thank you. That's it for me. Okay, is the Посольская жизнь Embassy Life with us? Good afternoon. We had two questions, but I believe you've already answered the first one regarding the statement of Mikhail Podolyak, the assistant to Zelensky, regarding the threats for Crimea. So now we have another question. Could the Crimean authorities ensure security for Russian tourists who are planning to spend their vacations there? Are you sure this is a question for the Foreign Ministry? Well, we see many incidents, the UAV strikes and so on. All the matters of security, including military security and protection, are the prerogative of our law enforcement and defense bodies. The way they protect the civilians and so on, only they can make a comment on that. I do not have the authority, and more importantly, I do not have the information regarding that. This is a matter for my colleagues. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have the Together Journal of Russian Compatriots? Yes, we're here. Good afternoon. I have two questions. First one. Due to the restrictions on the Russian media in many countries of the world, do you believe that the role of Russian compatriots in the information sphere is rising? Today I have mentioned the restrictions on the Russian media. Speaking for the media, for the compatriots and the information work done by the compatriots, unfortunately it is also subject to certain restrictions and pressure, and sometimes they're being bullied or even persecuted, unfortunately. But you're absolutely right that this is a separate area of work, and it's been many years in the making. This is a separate kind of information work, or rather a separate kind and way of life for many. They see it as their goal to talk to the compatriots and to inform them on the relevant events, to answer the questions, kind and way of life for many. They see it as their goal to talk to the compatriots and to inform them on the relevant events, to answer the questions. And this is the question that they're carrying out with dignity. This is the work done by our compatriots, as we call them, and their role is very important today, and it is on the rise. Thank you, and I have a second question. I wouldn't dare to ask it of anyone else, so I am asking you. Oh, so you can ask me that. I see. Thank you. Thank you for the trust. You know, it's some kind of a meme already. Who else can I ask this? I like that phrase. Alright, so here's the question. I'm only asking this because you give all the answers and because you have my special trust. So here's the question. Recently, I spent 5 hours at the bus station of Krakow in Poland, and I only heard the Russian language there. Mothers and children speaking Russian language, 2 or 3-year-olds talking to their parents only in Russian, which is their mother tongue. And the Poles see them as Ukrainians. I didn't hear any Ukrainian language at all. Only rarely I heard the village speak. Who are these people who are going to the West? What people do they represent? Are they our people or not? Are they refugees? Are they running from their regime or from Russia? These are the victims of the experiments of the collective West and the Western NATO-centrist regimes who believe that history, culture, the development of the civilizations do not matter, and therefore they could rewrite history, including recent and past history and lessons of the past, the memory of our ancestors. They did this before, and they were allowed to do so, and this time too. Where is the difference? Several centuries ago they could do that, and even more recently in the 20th century they were also doing that. They were measuring people, they were redrawing the maps, and they were ignoring any existing borders. They took absolutely voluntary approaches to dividing the people and the states. This is what they did in their colonies, which resulted in problems for many years ahead, and this is what they decided to do now. Sometimes they're trying to redraw the borders, or sometimes they're simply trying to organize their experiments to reload or restart an entire people, which represents various nationalities. Do you remember the button that Hillary Clinton gave as a present to Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, during their talks? She was shining with joy, saying that the button meant a reload, but in fact it said overload. There was a mistake made there. So perhaps they have made an attempt to reload an entire people living in the territory of Ukraine, but instead they have overloaded it. These are the people that we're talking about, people of various nationalities and ethnicities. These are the people who ask themselves how exactly they should identify themselves according to the Western standards. Previously it was all quite clear, and not because they had the guidelines to do so. No, this is because of the way they were raised. Within their families there was a certain atmosphere, and no one was even trying to find out exactly why they had, for example, Ukrainian surnames or Russian surnames. That was just the reality. Everything was mixed together. This was a historical stage that we went through. But now they have decided to reload and restart everything using the so-called melting pot principle. But instead they have overloaded this melting pot, and it turned into some sort of a hellish pot. Thank you very much. We see that there is good weather outside and spring has come. I wish you all the best. Thank you.